Welcome back, Journal Clubbers. Monday afternoon Journal Club, Ed Bowder and Dan Schwester on the Overrun.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're going to be talking about cardiac arrest because devotees of the show will know that we don't know what we're doing. So we found this study out of China. It came out in 2020. This is out of February. It's out of the Journal of Critical Care. This is the global survival rate among adult out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients who received CPR. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis. So what I like about meta-analyses, Dan, is it tends to go, it's a review of data of the data, right? They take all of the studies from X amount of time and kind of put them all together. So what they did in this is they found studies that ranged from 1976 to 2019. It ended up being an N of patients of over 4.6 million people, and they ended up with 141 eligible studies that we can see right here. And we're going to take the time to go into the inclusion and exclusion criteria of the paper, but I want to get some of the important things out of the way first. Pooled ROSC, 29.7% is the global number. Pooled survival to discharge, 22%. Rate of hospital discharge, 88%. 1 month survival rate is 10.7%, and the 1 year survival rate, 7.7%. So before we start getting into big numbers, Dan, we've talked previously about how we know that out-of-hospital cardiac arrest survival is low, and this seems to kind of agree with that.
Yeah, I agree. This is a 40-year retrospective look at all the data that we have. I was interested that out of almost 5,000, 5,600 papers, we could only find maybe 100, less than 150 that actually met the criteria for study. That just shows to me that we need to study this more, and we need more current research to take a look at what we're doing and what works and what doesn't work. Because 40 years, I mean, a lot's changed.
And to be fair, we have improved. We've gotten better over 40 years. But again, to be clear, we've gotten better to the tune of 8.8%. So, and something we talked about with Ken Milne this month in the podcast that's coming out soon is publication bias. And in the results here, it says the Eggers test did not indicate evidence of publication bias for the outcomes of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients who underwent CPR. I want to put a pin in that because as you read the study, you'll find that that's not necessarily the case. And again, when you're reading a study, and we always add this clarifier, if you read one study, you read one study. But you want to make sure if you're reading a study, you actually read through the entire study. So these results here, conclusions, global survival of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest who received CPR in the past has increased in the past 40 years. A higher survival rate post-out-of-hospital cardiac arrest is more likely among patients who receive bystander CPR and live in Western countries. Again, stuff that we kind of already knew, but has now generally been elucidated in the data. So the background of this paper, again, this came out of China. In China, they have 55 out-of-hospital cardiac arrests per 100,000 people years. There's more than 230 million people with cardiovascular disease, and they have over 500,000 cardiac arrests every year. And their survival for cardiac arrest is 1%. So again, further confirmation that cardiac arrest it's difficult to survive generally. But I imagine at least one of the impetuses behind starting this study was China's cardiac arrest survival rate is low. So, you want to study why and what we can do to make that better. Yeah, we have 1%, not great, suboptimal. Another kind of variable here is there's a lot of what's called heterogeneity across studies, which is adjusted for using statistical math. But essentially you have differing populations, differing treatments and things like that. But so we go through all these studies here. The inclusion I thought was interesting. And Dan, this is what you alluded to earlier. We started with 5,502 studies and an additional 13 records. And I love this. Records after duplicates removed, they got down to 4,600. So they lost about 1,000 patients in that recruitment process. And then when they started going through the screening of these records, they lost pretty much a lot of them. Now, this isn't a bad thing, right? We want to narrow it down to more specific papers.
Sure. This is a huge, wide analysis. You want to narrow your focus down to something that you actually study. 5,000 results will give you a wide band of data. Probably none of it is usable. And they did a good job. They looked like they really did a good job kind of boring down to the studies that were going to get a value for their paper.
And that's one of the hardest things in data and research is finding the right studies, right? Because again, we've talked about garbage in, garbage out, where if you if you analyze 6 bad studies, you're going to come up with another bad study.
Right.
So I appreciate the effort and the tenacity to come in and actually, figure all these out. Here they talk about the countries that were involved. The only continent that was not involved in this research was Antarctica. And here we found, so they looked at ROSC here, 62 studies with 74% patients. We found that ROSC, it has improved, I guess, over time. But I do want to give a shout out to our friends down in Australia and New Zealand who currently hold the record for highest ROSC rates at 38.6%. So
Nice
good
job.
news to all you guys
Well
down south, all our friends down under. You're doing a great job. Asia had the lowest incident of ROSC. And again, we talked about China having a 1% survival rate. Europe is second. And something I want to give a shout out to the authors in here because they just don't mention the Americas at all.
But I found this to be really interesting because of there's cultural differences. That's the question that I have looking at this data. Is there something that exists in Europe or Australia and New Zealand that kind of lowers people's filter to get involved as opposed to Asia? I don't know. That would be a really interesting paper.
And there's certainly variables too, like the cultural respect to death. Right. Is, in a lot of Eastern cultures, they tend to be a lot more accepting of death as part of the natural life cycle.
True.
And I think especially in the United States specifically, but I think in, the capital A Americas writ large, we tend to say that like, well, no, we can save everybody. So I base that off nothing, but I tend to think that might be part of the answer there. Seeing a variable of a worldwide survival of 8 or almost 9% down to China's 1%, it feels like there has to be some sort of cultural thing involved at that level. So we get into admission here, and again, 22% of patients survive to admission. They get down to discharge, and I'm blowing through this because this is all kind of repetitive stuff that we already know.
Yeah.
Right, 1 year survival rate down to 7.7%. So let's get into some of the more interesting analysis stuff here. We talk about this publication bias, and I think Dr. Crow talked about this earlier, and certainly Dr. Milne has talked about it. Publication bias is important because it doesn't just tell you what you know, it can also help to tell you what you don't know. Right. And with publication biases, you might put out a study that doesn't give you the results that you want. And instead of publishing a paper that says that you failed to reject the null hypothesis, you might just not publish it at all. Right. So like Dan,
if you change the parameters of the study to make it work for you.
Right. Exactly. So like you and I could write a study and it would be, I think that Wawa is a superior gas station food to Buc-ee's, Remley. And, it turns out that it turns out that we're right. Then if someone was researching it, they would have to be like, oh, well, maybe that's not true, or just, hide the data and not publish it. But earlier in the paper, we talked about how it says that there was no publication bias. Yet, let's go into the meat of the paper, where we see, however, for the 1 month survival among out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients who underwent CPR, we found that Egger's tests revealed evidence of publication bias across studies. So to be clear, this paper at various points says there's no publication bias and then says, actually, there is publication bias. So let's get into this where it talks about the 1 month survival. Why would we think there might be some publication bias of patients who survive out-of-hospital cardiac arrest to discharge? What do we think that variable might be, Dan?
Well, we all want to be good. We all want to perform, and we all want our places to say that they're the best. And if your shop has some structural issues, or you're identifying it in a study, especially if they're the people that are funding you, that's a bias that's going to turn up.
Yep. I think that has to be part of this. And again, this is speculative. We don't know. But if you're going to keep kind of aligned with all the data until the out-of-hospital discharge thing, it seems kind of interesting. So, and some of these patients may be lost to follow-up. It can be hard to continue a study after patients go home. But it does at least a little bit seem like we might not have the right numbers for the discharge patients.
Right.
So the discussion here, again, first comprehensive review in 40 years to talk about all these things. we're going to get into some of our own analysis here in a second, but generally speaking, pretty good strengths here, right? It's the first study investigating out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients worldwide. They did a subgroup analysis that showed the discharge rate was much lower in developing countries. So a lot of really good information. There are limitations. There's a lot of heterogeneity. Again, a lot of mixed samples. You know, the quality of CPR could be different. The research method could be different. A lot of different variables here. But let's go ahead now. I'm going to go back up to the top of this paper here so that you guys can see the reference. And again, this is at a critical care here. This is Shijiao Yang et al. And we're talking about cardiac arrest here. So now, Dan, let's go into some of our more interesting analysis here. This is a paper that reviewed our systems and talked about how we're doing, and it turns out 8.8%.
Yeah, but I want to look past that number on this. Look, we're talking, you know, cardiac arrest is a Hail Mary play. It's when everything else has failed, the body has failed. It is very often a pre-terminal condition, and we're trying to reverse that. Could they have benefited with could they have gotten a higher rate by better selecting patients? Sure, they could. Could they do a lot of things in that to kind of make the numbers work a little bit better? Yeah, we've seen that in studies.
Yeah.
But what I was really impressed in was that after 40 years of study on all of these studies, the things that matter most are the basics. Go out, train your citizens in CPR, teach bystander CPR, have your dispatchers be able to give CPR instructions over the phone, and get somebody on the chest right away. When you get somebody on the chest, and then the next thing we do, let's get an AED there as fast as we possibly can, because if we're going to fix somebody, it's going to be that shockable rhythm, and we have a very narrow window for it. So the basics work here, and we've got 40 years of data that are showing that's what we got to do. So maybe it's not the new coolest monitor, or maybe it's not the machine that raises the head of the bed, or maybe it's just we get out and train people. Why we can't make every EMS provider a CPR instructor? I don't know why. Why aren't we in the malls? Yeah. Why aren't we in the shopping centers and the resorts teaching hands-free CPR and getting people comfortable with the idea of putting your hands on the chest, taking care of somebody, and giving them the best possible chance? We're probably not going to ever get better than 10 or 15% survival. I don't know if it's possible.
Yeah,
but we can maximize it.
Well, so I don't know that we shoot north of 10 or 15%. And again, generally, I think it's because life is a terminal condition. A variable that and again, I don't know that we can control of you. It is, right? But, you know, you consider, like, if I have, how many of those out-of-hospital cardiac arrests are, whatever, I'll be hyperbolic, but an 85-year-old metastatic cancer patient?
We don't know.
You know, where their survivability in absence of the cardiac arrest was 10% anyway. You know, so there's a lot of hard things to kind of adjust and to control for in these types of studies, but I don't want the hard to be the enemy of the good. You know, so if you're going to, this is stuff that we have to know, right? We have to do this research. Absolutely. We have to know this data. And there's, you know, there's a 10-year translation gap in data and information. So what bothers me is that this paper came out in February of 2020. We're talking about it in April of 24. And what's going to end up happening is that by the time April of 34 rolls around, we will finally have kind of accepted that maybe this data works a little.
Yeah, I think so. You know, I think that's a really good point. I think we also have to recognize that CPR works for a narrow population with a very narrow window. I tend to think that we have to select patients better. It sounds controversial. It sounds, you know, like I'm being heartless, but we shouldn't be doing CPR on that 85-year-old with, you know, comorbidities. We should be comfortable with natural death, and we're not in this country. And I think once we do that, we're going to see the survival rates come up because we're going to have better patient selection.
Yeah, and certainly there's aspects of medicine that are societal or cultural that don't necessarily affect clinical medicine, right? And you know, and again, we can talk about anecdote here too. How many jobs have you been on with people who, you know, families or bystanders who didn't want to do CPR because they were afraid they were going to hurt the person?
A lot. Too many now.
You know,
in this day and age, way too many.
Yeah. Yep. Oh, and again, worse, they're afraid they're going to get sued.
Absolutely.
And I you know, I'll tell you, if it's your first time doing CPR and you have a little bit of fear about litigation for helping somebody, doing that first compression is going to convince you that you're going to get sued for something. That first crack when you're doing CPR really changes your perspective really quickly. But that, again, that might be part of it too, right? Your first compression is very scary, so you might be completely on board with doing CPR, do your first compression, and feel yourself flailing the sternum of a stranger, and just be like, "I'm good. I'm not gonna do this anymore." What the study didn't look at, or at least it didn't discuss, was the interventions that are associated in these cardiac arrests. So this is where we have to start talking about what the preponderance of data says, right? If this study shows that 8%, 9%, 8.8%, whatever, are survive to discharge, right? That's awesome. The paper doesn't mention their CPC scores, which is your cerebral functioning on discharge. So Danny and I right now are CPC 1s, and this table that I'm recording at is a CPC 4. Sort of like a Glasgow thing, right? Like you're either a 15 or a 3 most days. So it doesn't go into, you know, different variables in cardiac arrest. So, you know, there's always going to be somebody who's like, well, it doesn't look at everything, so it's not a perfect paper.
There's no perfect paper.
There's no such
Ever.
thing. There's no perfect paper. And again, you know, throwing out the good in pursuit of the perfect, where it's like, okay, we have data now that just says we're not doing CPR effectively as an industry. That's it. Like that, I can't in good faith read through any of these papers and come to any other conclusion aside from pre-hospitally, we are substandard at CPR. And that's just what the data says. So there may be that we're actually really, really good at it. We're just not publishing it, which is its own problem. There might be a publication bias where the shops that are doing extraordinarily well don't have enough money to publish. They don't have enough resources or time. So there is a possibility that I'm willing to accept that we might be crushing it, right? EMS might be the pinnacle of out of hospital of cardiac arrest, right? But if we are, I'm imploring anybody to write that paper so that we can finally stop saying that we suck at CPR. But until that day, 8.8%. And it's going to stay that way, it seems, for the next 40 years. And we have to start asking as a culture, as an industry, as a business, as a profession, however you want to label what we do, how do we improve this? And again, year after year after year, there's data that says that bystander CPR and bystander defibrillation are the things that work, right? We can sit here for days talking about anecdote where a couple of weeks ago we talked about triple sequential defibrillation. And that's an awesome thing. That's an awesome trick that happened. And I couldn't be happier that it worked for the patient.
Outlier.
That said, I will not, exactly. I'm not going to triple sequential defibrillate every patient, but I will be doing CPR on almost all of them.
The data on ECMO is great. The stuff that they do in Minnesota and in Paris has shown that this works very, very well, but it's selection of the patients. You're not going to be able to do this for every patient. It's not feasible. So what do we have to do? We have to identify what works. And for the vast majority of the population, to give them the best chance at survival, early defibrillation, early CPR, getting somebody on the chest before anybody with a uniform gets there. And that's what we know works.
And I worry that sometimes we might be kind of beating a dead horse with all this cardiac arrest stuff, right? And it's just a function of, we read the data. So we sit there and we're like, oh, look, another thing that says, cardiac arrest survivability is low. But I think now that we have this meta-analysis, and again, this has been out for almost 4 years now, this is hardly new. Now that we have this paper, we can go to industry leaders, we can go to, our supervisors, our directors, like, this is what we know, right? The first thing is our shop at or around what's now the national standard, right? When we're treating cardiac arrests, what is our survival to discharge percentage? What's our survival to admission percentage? What's our ROSC percentage, right? Again, I don't love the ROSC statistic. I don't know that it has any real value, because again, you can get a ROSC back in a patient, you take them to the hospital, you move them, they lose pulses, and so now you could be like, I got a ROSC back, but if you're resuscitating a turn up, you haven't really succeeded in anything. But I do think that the survival to admission, survival to discharge is very important. So I think one of the first things that places have to do is know those numbers. And if you're not aware of those numbers, talk to the hospitals, find them, because I promise you they do. So that's your first thing. Are you at generally the same level as the rest of the country? That's your first analysis. If your project has a ROSC or a survival discharge rate of 3%, you want to know why you're that much lower than the national average. And it could be a function of your system or the hospital, right? So, before we get out of here, we want to talk about how do we improve this as a system. Danny, if you're running your system and you want to get your staff or develop an initiative to kind of make things go a little bit better, what's your first thing? Like what is your what's the Olympic torch that you'll carry?
First thing is measure, right? You got to measure these things. You've got to look at your cardiac arrests. You've got to QA them. You've got to put things together. You got to make a database. If I was running a place now, I would make sure my agency and my hospital joined the CARES registry to add into the data stream for that. I would look at what's working and what's not. I'd have meetings with my stakeholders, get your dispatch agency involved, get your cardiology practices involved, because these are going to be their patients. They've got a vested interest in making as many patients as possible. And get the people involved who have a stake in it. And then you can come up with some solutions. Maybe the answer is defibrillators in all your patrol cars. Maybe it's putting people out in PR things at National Night Out and, on a regular basis, like in the mall or something like that, to teach hands-free CPR. Maybe it's public service announcements. Maybe it's, there's a lot of things you can do nowadays, and a lot of it you could do on the internet. It doesn't take a lot. There's grant money out there for this stuff. There's plenty of funds available. You just need people to take the first step and say, hey, let's get better at this.
No, and I think that's right. And there's, if you're in a community that has low outcomes, you can you can do it. If you're an EMS provider, you can get your CPR instructor certification. You can teach AHA courses, or there's plenty of opportunities to teach lay people CPR, which is just doing compressions at the rate of 100 per minute. If you want to make it fun, Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, where our medical director, Mike DeFilippo, worked, has put out a list on Spotify of songs that you can do CPR to. So if you want to make the worst day of someone's life more entertaining for you, there is a Spotify playlist so that you can do compressions at the right rate. But no, I think most of all that's right. I think you have to fix your system kind of
and publish
at home first, and then sort of build it out.
What are we doing?
Yeah, put out your data. It's not getting. Yeah, if you have better outcomes than 8.8, better than the worldwide average. And if you have better rates than, the super world champions down in Australia and New Zealand, certainly we want to know about that too, because, if you're in Australia, tell us what you're doing right. we want to know your secrets. But again, super important conversation. I think now that we have this information, we can kind of use it to improve outcomes and maybe have a better idea of, what good CPR looks like at a project, whether it's, pit crew CPR or something more coordinated, whether you use devices or hands-on. But a lot of variabilities here, but we know worldwide 8.8%. So now that we have that figure, we can start to do better and build those numbers up. So let us know what you guys think. What do you think your CPR numbers are? What are your ROSC numbers? And how do you think we can improve outcomes? Leave comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube. Listen to the Overrun wherever you get your podcast. There's going to be a button. Yeah, wait for it there. That's where the button's going to be. So subscribe on YouTube, do all the other things. And for the Overrun, I'm Ed Bowder.
Take care.
And we'll see you all next Monday. Talk to you then.